Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz pianist, composer, educator, and author Andy Jaffe. We talked to him on May 24, 2020 about how he's been doing during the COVID-19 lockdown. He has been a leader in jazz education for the last 30 years. He's taught at the Berklee College of Music and so many other institutions. Between performance and education, he is a gem in the jazz world. Get to know him and dig this interview.
Cool. So when did you start realizing, like mid-March or whatever, that live jazz was coming to a halt? Did you have canceled gigs, or what was going on with you?
Well, what was going on with me was my record was just coming out, and the record company had made a decision to postpone, I think, till April so they could coordinate with Downbeat or some other things. And anyway, it turned out to be a fateful error because few of the radio stations actually got the CD because it was in their mailbox where the state radio station is or something. And so compared to the last record, there's really very little airplay, very few reviews, and, of course, no gigs. So, yeah, I realized it quite early because my trumpet player for 3 of my 5 CDs and my former student, Wallace Roney, was one of the first casualties. And so it became obvious we had a problem. And we have one son in Boston and just finished NEC, and one who's in New York as a freelance bass player, and we just insisted that they come home right away. My daughter lives with her husband, so she was already home. But, there have been so many mentors and friends and colleagues, and a lot of people, frankly, my age, who have been taken from us.
It has been pretty devastating. So what is it? I mean, obviously with this release here, I know that some people view this as a time that people have more latitude to listen to recorded music, but also you can't back it up live,
Right. You can't, jazz depends on interactivity between people in real time. And, one of the composition programs I teach at, they're adjusting to have everybody record their tracks one at a time. And, there will still be improvised and solos and so on, but there won't be that interactive energy that one gets from actual live performance. So, it's real question about which clubs will recover after this and which festivals will still be held and how soon that will happen. Our entire economy, but especially the musicians' economy, performance economy, and the recording industry, all of that's changing completely now. Yeah, we can still scribble, and we can still record things, but it's not the same. And against the natural order of things to have the students die first,
Right. Yeah, I get it. Well, let's go back to the beginnings of your life. Talk to me about where you were born and raised and how jazz became a part of your world.
Okay. So I was born in Washington, D.C. When I was in first grade, or actually I guess in kindergarten, my family moved to New York, and just outside the city where I lived till I went to high school, which we moved again, and I went to high school in Amherst, Mass. And in both New York and in Amherst, I had friends and neighbors my age who were interested in jazz. My next-door neighbor in New York was Louis Armstrong aficionado during the days of Hello, Dolly, and, he was a trumpet player, too. And then I had friends in Amherst who were really interested, and this is in the 60s in high school, really interested in jazz, and, we bought every Miles record right when it came out. We'd take it home and listen to it, and same with Coltrane. And so we all went to see whatever music we could, and then when I was, after college, I went to Berklee for a minute, and then, I skipped a part. I lived in Switzerland for a couple of years, went to college there, and then after regular college, I went to Berklee, and when I was at Berklee, I met a lot of people I'm still in touch with to this day, and then I went to UMass for grad school during the Max Roach era, we call it. I was his teaching assistant. We also had, Billy Taylor, and we had Horace Boyer and Yusef Latif. It was a tremendous program that was organized by my late mentor, Fred Tillis. He left us about a month ago at the age of 90. and really important to my development because when he came to UMass, there were no other black faculty to speak of, and certainly not in the music department. It was a typical sort of Eurocentric, traditional music department, and he, by the force of will and personality, managed to change the whole place and started Jazz in July and mentored several of us who were aspiring composers, and he was very important. And then after that, I wound up teaching at Berklee, and then I wound up living in France again, and then back to New York, and then back here to Western Mass when I came home to roost, I like to say. And we have 3 wonderful kids. They're all much better musicians than me and all different from each other. And that kept me pretty rooted until 3 years ago when I retired from Williams. And I still teach at a low residency MFA in music composition program at the Vermont College of Fine Arts. And so we meet 2 weeks a year in person, although not this semester. We meet online now. And then the rest of the time, people work one-on-one with their mentor. And then what else? Oh, yeah, so I also go to Taipei in Taiwan and teach about 8 weeks every semester by an arrangement with the government and a couple of universities there. But I'm obviously not doing that right now. I'm hoping to get back in November.
Yeah.
And they've handled it much better than we have. They're a much smaller country, and people are more attuned to following the rules, and they're very well organized. And so they've actually beaten it, I think. But they are not like Canada or any other place you can think of right now. They're not very excited about having visitors from America at this point.
What do you like the best about being a musician? What's been the most pleasing thing throughout all these years?
The best thing about being a musician, I guess it's a necessary creative outlet, you know. You hear something in your head and you can't play it all by yourself, and so you need to organize some people to do it with you. And the social aspect, you know, I was drawn, in the 60s, I was drawn to people I was drawn to of my own generation and mentors and musicians I like to listen to. They were all, the most interesting musicians were all jazz musicians. There was just there's nothing that compares with that challenge, except for maybe some forms of Indian music, which I don't know enough about to actually execute. But I love it.
What experiences over your career, you know, with musicians or in your travels and playing, have you really drawn on that's helped you as a teacher?
Well, that's a very interesting question. That's the most profound question. So what I always tell, because I do a lot of workshops mentoring younger aspiring teachers and, you know, websites that deal with that sort of thing. And my first premise is you always have to start where the student is. So your first job as a teacher is to engage the student individually and see what they know, what they don't know, what they're drawn to, and, you know, not just give them a blanket set of things to learn, but adjust the pedagogy to fit the student. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I've always been able to remember what it was like to be learning. And, you know, so I try to keep that memory vivid in my mind so I can remember, oh, yeah, I remember I had trouble with this. How did I figure out how to deal with it? Because in my generation, you didn't get much in the way of theory. Or it's ironic that I've become a theorist and write books and all this stuff like that, because when I was starting out, there weren't any books like that to speak of, and so you had to learn. There certainly weren't classes. You had to learn by watching people play. It was still part of the oral tradition, and by listening to records. So, you know, if you can remember those lessons of how you dealt with a particular issue you were studying or trying to master, it's really helpful, I think, in teaching. I think a lot of us have gotten to the point where with all our advanced degrees and training and experience, we kind of forgot that. And so, you know, you see some really great players who have forgotten that lesson, or maybe they never had any difficulty with anything, who knows, but they're just not very talented teachers because they've forgotten what it's like to be at the level of students at.
So why do you love jazz?
Why do I love jazz? Oh, man, I could go on and on and on. I mean, it's like any love is to some degree irrational, right? It's like if you say, why do you love your wife? Why do you love your kids? I mean, you can make all kinds of rational arguments about why, but actually when you come right down to it, you can't always explain it. It's just something you're drawn to, something that you need, something that answers creative need for you that can't be answered any other way. I mean, if I were skilled in art, maybe there would have been a way I could have expressed a creative need in that way, but I'm not. And, you know, in music, this was the only viable option for me given the culture and the times in which I grew up. And it's a great way to meet people. The people you meet are usually really great, usually really supportive. Jazz musicians, as a rule, appreciate the mentoring process, and they respect their elders, and there's a lot of tradition that's bound up in that that's very, very important. And so you can meet some pretty hip people, and you can be part of a continuum when you're involved in this. I didn't realize this all when I started. I was just drawn to it because I love the sound of it, love the freedom of it, and also, you know, for reasons I won't really go into because they're more medically based, I did not read well. So I was always improvising even when I was supposedly taking classical piano lessons because I physically could not read this stuff too well. So I got to develop a pretty good ear, and I got to realize early on that you had to be able to visualize what was in your head in terms of, you know, what chord it was, what notes it was, and so on, so that you could realize it. I guess being able to express the inexpressible, being able to encode what you're hearing in a way that's accessible to other players so that they can play along with you, right? Because if you're a composer or arranger, I mean, I've written for all kinds of ensembles, and usually I don't play most of the instruments I write for, but I have to have listened a lot to have my hearing condition into the possibilities of those instruments individually and in combination, and then I have to be able to translate what's in my head to the paper and then write it in a way that's playable. So a lot of experience, stuff that can't be taught, really.
You know, we're going to get to the end of this COVID-19, and we're going to get back to live music. We don't know when, but it'll happen. And when we do, what do you hope both the crowd and the musician realizes about this absence of live music?
Oh, that's such a great question. Well, I think for musicians it will be obvious that the need for actual conversationally made music between players is something that will have been missing, and that's very important. I mean, you know, you just can't get the same level of interaction when you're not all playing at the same time. You can simulate it, but it's not the same. And that's what the musicians will realize, and also the attendant lack of camaraderie, because there's an interaction between and among the musicians and between the musicians and the audience that occurs that doesn't occur in a studio or in a internet scenario. I think that the audience, I think a lot of people have spoken to this too. I wish I could cite something for you here, but I'm not coming up with anything. But there's been a lot written about the audience as a participant in a jazz performance, and I think the energy that you get from the audience and the response that they offer during a performance is really kind of an important thing, and it changes the nature of the performance a lot. So they're like another ensemble member. And I'm sure that the audience will likewise miss being a part of that camaraderie among the musicians and with the musicians and among each other, you know. I mean, any event you go to that's attended by other people, you socialize, and, you know, your world is enriched by that experience.
My final question to you is this. Everyone has a perception of you, your family, your friends, your fans, your students, but you're the one living your life. Who do you think you are?
That's a good question, depending on the inflection, I suppose. Who do you think you are?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, no, it's very funny. I enjoy that. So I think this is a great question for me now, actually, because I've been grappling with this lately. So I've always thought of myself primarily as a composer, a band leader, secondarily as a teacher, and I try to be supportive of other musicians and other students who eventually sometimes become my fellow musicians, my colleagues, in that process. But actually, probably most of the world thinks of me as an educator. I'm probably better known for that. You know, I'll meet people and they'll be like, "Oh, you wrote that book. Oh, yeah, I recognize your name." And, you know, I just want people to listen to what I want most is for people to play the tunes I've written, and that's why I document them, whether in recording or written or both situations sometimes. And unfortunately not able to do both, but that's the reason I record the music. That's the reason I write it, and I'd like to be thought of first and foremost as a composer. I'm a half-ass pianist, really. I've just taught myself, and I've learned well enough to be able to play my own tunes and lead a band, and play solo gigs and that kind of thing. And I'm a pretty good accompanist, a vocalist too, but I'm not really a virtuoso by any means, and there's certain settings where I wouldn't be comfortable.
Hey, man, Andy, thank you for taking some time out.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest cats on the East Coast, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Andy for his time, music, and story. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.